Hello, AP Environmental Science students. In today's screencast, we're going to continue talking about Chapter 5, which is Biodiversity and Evolution. All of today's notes are based off of Living in the Environment, the 16th edition, by Miller and Spoolman. So, Chapter 5.3 discusses what limits the growth of population. No population can continue to grow indefinitely because of limitations on resources and because of competition among species for those resources. So in this section, you're going to see some overlap with our first unit when we talked about human population, because there's a lot of things like carrying capacity and limiting factors and density independent and dependent factors that are going to come back up again. So what is population dynamics? Population dynamics is the study of how characteristics of populations, like distribution, age structure, density, change in response to changes in environmental conditions. These changes in environmental conditions can include things like temperature, presence of disease organisms or harmful chemicals, resource availability, and arrival or disappearance of competing species. Population distribution is how a population is distributed or spaced out in an area. So there's three major patterns of population distribution. There's clumping, there's uniform, and there's random. So how do species decide whether they're going to clump or not clump? Clumping, species generally cluster near an area where resources are plentiful. Groups are more successful in finding new resources when they travel together. They protect themselves from predators. They engage in pack hunting because that increases their chance of finding and catching prey. And they form temporary groups to care for young. Humans clump. We live in cities. We live near areas of lots of resources. We live together. In early days when humans were actually still hunting their food, they would use clumps to help find what they needed to eat. So clumping is generally the most popular form of population distribution. Not clumping, we have two options. We have uniform dispersion, and that's even distribution that could result from individuals competing for a limited resource. Think of creosote bushes in the desert. They need to be spaced out in distances from each other so they have enough water that they can actually take up from the surrounding area. Random dispersion is there's no rhyme or reason why they're dispersed the way they are, and it's very rare. So populations can shrink, grow, or stay the same. And the four variables that we've already talked about are births, deaths, immigration, which is moving in, or emigration, which is exiting. So the equation is population change is equal to births plus immigration minus deaths plus emigration. We've also talked about age structure. We looked at a bunch of age structure diagrams, but again, this is the proportions of individuals at various ages, like pre-reproductive ages, reproductive, and post-reproductive ages. So, biotic potential. Biotic potential is the capacity for a population to grow under ideal conditions. If something has low biotic potential, they are usually large, slowly maturing organisms, like blue whales and lions. High biotic potential are usually small organisms with high reproductive rates. They reproduce really early in life, have short generation times, can reproduce many times over and over again, and have many offspring at one time. Bacteria and insects are examples of organisms with high biotic potential. So here's an example. We've got our house mouse, which reaches sexual maturity at 1 month. When it reproduces, it produces litters of 6 to 10 offspring at a time, and it's generally once a month. Elephants, on the other hand, reach sexual maturity after ages 8 to 13, but they often don't mate until they're 20. Gestation or pregnancy is around 22 months. So in this case, if we're comparing these two organisms, our mouse would have a higher biotic potential than our elephants. So some vocab that's important to know is the intrinsic rate of increase, or R. And this is the rate of population growth if it had unlimited resources. So this is kind of your ideal rate of increase. Environmental resistance is the combination of all the factors that limit population growth. Carrying capacity, or K, is your maximum population that habitat can sustain based on the available resources. Exponential growth is rapid growth, and logistic growth is rapid exponential growth followed by a steady decrease until the population size levels off. So this would be an example of logistic growth. We have this increase, and then we start to level off at carrying capacity. You'll notice that my stable population, it still fluctuates. So we still see this little back and forth, but it is around that carrying capacity. It never goes too high or too low. Sometimes we have things called overshoots, which we'll discuss later in this presentation, where my population goes way too far over, then it comes way back down and it starts to crash. So, carrying capacity, again, not fixed. It can fluctuate due to climate changes, immigration, emigration, natural disasters, boom in the availability of a resource. Because of this, there's something called reproductive lag time, where all of a sudden we have this new resource that's available, so our population goes crazy. So in this case, we have our reindeer. Our population, something happened here-ish that made resources much more available. And all of a sudden there was this boom in my reindeer population. However, all of a sudden that resource that was super abundant is now being eaten by all of these reindeer, so our population crashes. Once we have this overshoot, which is this high increase above carrying capacity, we often have dieback or a crash, which again is this drop. So, how does biotic potential affect the intrinsic rate of increase in a population? Again, biotic potential was capacity for population growth under ideal conditions, and intrinsic rate of increase, or R, is the rate of population growth if it had unlimited resources. A species with high biotic potential will have a greater intrinsic rate of increase because it's able to have more offspring in a shorter period of time, leading to a faster rate of reproductive or population growth. So, there are species that have different reproductive patterns. One of those species are R-selected species. And these are opportunists, generally generalists, that favor times when environmental conditions are caused by density-dependent factors, our populations soar, and then they crash. So here, they have many offspring, they come to maturity and reproduce early, they're capable of withstanding environmental changes, their populations fluctuate wildly above and below carrying capacity. Adults are small. There's little to no parental care. Like I said, they're usually generalists, and they have a low ability to compete. Then we have K-selected species. K-selected species are competitors that favor times when they are near their carrying capacity. There's a few strong individuals that compete for resources. So characteristics of a K-selected species are late successional species. They have fewer and larger offspring. They have a later reproductive age. They're not capable of withstanding major environmental changes. Populations will stabilize near carrying capacity. Adults are larger. They give some type of parental care, and they have a high ability to compete. So my R-selected species are usually like things like insects. They reproduce quickly, they don't live very long, they have a short gestational period. K-selected species are things like rhinos. Genetic diversity can affect the size of small populations a lot more than large populations, because when we have these small isolated populations, genetic diversity is limited, and it can be due to a couple of things. First, we have the founder effect, and this occurs when a few individuals in a population colonize a new habitat that's geographically isolated from other members of the population. This limited genetic diversity or variability can threaten the survival of a population. So think of it like a few of us moved to a completely remote island. The only genes that are going with us are the ones that we already possess. So all of that genetic diversity that's in the entire population no longer exists because only a few individuals are actually starting this new population. Then we have a demographic bottleneck, and this occurs when only a few individuals survive a catastrophe, such as a fire or a hurricane. And when this happens, again, your population is cut down to a very small set of individuals with a very small set of genetic information. This lack of genetic diversity, again, can limit the ability for my individuals to rebuild their population. We also have genetic drift. Genetic drift involves random changes in the gene frequencies in a population that can lead to unequal reproductive success. So maybe this peacock gets all of the bright colored genes and this peacock gets all of the kind of duller genes. Males attract their females by how pretty they look. So randomly, one of them hit the genetic jackpot, one of them did not. They're not able to reproduce. We lose a lot of these dull genes and all of the bright ones continue. Inbreeding is another reason. It occurs when individuals in small populations mate with each other, which increases the frequency of defective genes within a population. We always think of like royal bloodlines that wanted to keep things pure, so they only married within their family and had kids, and then we had a lot of members of royalty that had genetic issues. Minimum viable population size is the number of individuals a population needs for long-term survival. So these kind of things, minimum viable population size would broaden how many individuals there are to prevent things like inbreeding and to increase genetic diversity. So limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of an environment for our species. We have density dependent, which depend on the size of a population, and these can include things like competition, predation, parasitism, and disease. And we have density independent factors, where the size of the population doesn't matter. This includes things like natural disasters, climate changes, or unusual weather. It also includes human impact. Finally, we have several different types of population change that occurs in nature. First, we have a stable population, and that's a population whose size only fluctuates slightly above or below carrying capacity. We have erupted, which is where population growth occasionally explodes to a high peak and then crashes. So this is that overshoot and die back we were talking about earlier. Cyclic fluctuation, or boom and bust, are where populations cycle from very high to very low population levels, and this can occur for two reasons. Because of top-down population regulation, meaning that predation has increased, so my population goes down, or bottom-up, where the size of the predator and prey populations is controlled by the scarcity of initial resources. So that could be like food or water or whatever. And then we have irregular populations, which is where a population has no reoccurring pattern. It's kind of random. There's not really a reason for why our populations are growing or shrinking.